So welcome back, everyone, to the 2011 Jean Donovan International Social Justice Conference, Repression, Resistance, and Transformation in Central America. I am happy to report that all of our panelists are here now. With the weather, something, somebody, something, some energy, essence, something was looking out for us because it has been going fabulous, and I'm just so glad and happy that everyone has made it here. Michael Lee, who was scheduled to be on our first session, is here, and he will be on the afternoon session as our fourth speaker, so we will get to hear from all of them. So once again, welcome. I am so glad that all of you have decided to come out today and come back this afternoon after lunch. I'm glad that Marixa said, Rhonda, did you get coffee for the afternoon session and some sugar? And I was like, oh, do I really need to do that, Marixa? She's like, yes. So I'm glad that she said that, and we have that back there for you to keep you rejuvenated. I just want to start really quickly and then hand this over to Marixa so that we can get started. That as the first session ended, a lot of things were going through my head, and I had thought about sharing some of that after the first session, but Joy Bostic ended it so perfectly with her wonderful quote and her wonderful statement at the end that I just didn't want to ruin that in any way whatsoever. But I want us to think about as we move into this next session, that really is going to get us to think about the relationship between the history and the present and the future, as did our first session. I mean, there really was that dialogue there, that critical dialogue. I want to call back some terms and phrases that were raised in that first session, just by way of transition. Transcending boundaries, structural injustice, not simply charity, thinking about the root causes of problems, and thinking about how we can enact social change based on understanding those root causes. And that, for me, was particularly poignant because the mission of the Social Justice Institute here is working toward equal access to opportunity for all people through understanding and addressing the root causes of social injustice and developing innovative solutions. The idea of education and the role of education in various spaces, schools and classrooms and churches, and the idea that Sister Sheila raised about children being able to think for themselves and how we need to engage in facilitating that process, both for the next generation, but also, I think, in an intergenerational context. And the idea of solidarity. And many of you who were here this morning, you know that I had a quote from James Baldwin, and I have another one for you from James Baldwin. I'm walking around with my quote book. Again, that just came to me as I was listening to these phrases that emerge from the audience. And in particular, in relationship to that kind of educative moment, that relationship of intergenerational learning and knowledge production, I want to say this from James Baldwin, and then I want to turn it over to Marixa to get us started on this next phase of our education path here together this afternoon. James Baldwin said this with respect to African Americans in particular, and he used the phrase Negro because at that time that was the phrase that was used with a capital N, as opposed to any other particular phrase that was disparaging. And this was 1948. But you can really substitute Negro, African American for any of us, however we define ourselves, okay? And here's what James Baldwin said in Notes of a Native Son. He said, any Negro who takes schooling at face value will find himself virtually incapacitated for life in this democracy. So what we are doing is digging deeper, going deeper, trying to bring out complexity and nuance and have the kinds of conversation that will allow us to think more analytically, that will allow us to think in more fruitful ways and challenge the face value. Dr. Marixa Lasso, I'm bringing to the podium here. And Marixa Lasso, please come up, Marixa. Marixa Lasso, I'm not going to retell the story because I told it last night and it's also in the program brochure. But the reason that we're having this conference, one of the reasons that we're having this conference is that Dr. Marixa Lasso came to me and said, do you know about Jean Donovan, who was a Case Western alum? And from there, with other interventions, this is where we are. So Dr. Marixa Lasso.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. As a historian of Latin America and of Colombia and Central America, I am so delighted that we can, following the quote that Rhonda Williams just cited, we can delve in deep about this region of the world, about the problems and the injustices that are happening there, and go beyond easy assessments on headlines and get into the substance of the problems and the histories. And the first panel we spoke, and we heard a lot about the historical context, the ideological, intellectual context, religious context of gentleman's death and the conflict at the time. Today we're going to think a little bit about how we remember those moments, the history, the legacy, and how they affect what is happening today in Central America from different perspectives. So I'm going to introduce all of the speakers one at a time before each talk. So I'm going to start with our first speaker, Professor Jeffrey Gould. Jeffrey Gould is the James Rudy Professor of History at Indiana University. He was the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. His most recent book is To Rise in Darkness, Revolution, Repression, and Memory in El Salvador, 1920-1932, co-authored with Aldo Lauria Santiago. He previously published To Lead Us Equal, Rural Protest and Political Consciousness in Chinandega, Nicaragua, 1912-1979. And today, in this way, another book, Nicaraguan Indian Communities and the Myth of Mestizaje, 1880-1865. He's also co-editor of Memorias de Mestizaje, la Política Cultural en América Central desde 1900. Gould also co-directed and produces Scars of Memory, El Salvador, 1932, a documentary film, award merit of the Latin American Studies Association. He's currently, and we're going to see some of that, completing another documentary film titled La Palabra en el Bosque that deals with peasants in Morazán, El Salvador, during the 1970s. In 2002, he was awarded the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship. So welcome, and we're so glad to have you here.
Well, I'd like to thank Marixa for the introduction and Rhonda for helping put together this event, and to all of the audience for putting up with all the late arrivals and cancellations. I'm going to start in a minute a film clip that's going to start in minute 5 to save time. The film itself is 60 minutes, but I got my 17-year-old son to subtitle 25 minutes. So we're going to start in minute 5, and since he was doing it on, in his own busy schedule, emphasis on social life, he got around to finishing it late Thursday night, so I haven't even looked at it yet, so I'm got my fingers crossed. And so we're going to start off in minute 5, and basically the first 5 minutes, which there's not time enough to see, really kind of lay out, sort of in a cinematographic way, what Morazán looks like, and then starts off dealing with the issues of marginalization and poverty in Morazán during that period. In Morazán, of all the 14 departments, was ranked the lowest. Its quality of life indices were along those of sub-Saharan Africa at the time. So it's right in the middle after talking about the poverty and about local repression. This was all before the organizations started. Te van a violar, le dijo, y después van a andar ahí denunciando, ¿no? Lean por rap. A los mechos les quitaba el pelo también. Y si cuando uno iba caminando, tenía que ir caminando viendo hacia el camino, porque si no lo volteaba a ver. Y si uno le caía mal, ya le llamaban porque él volteaba a ver. Ahí le quitaban los cascos, y con los cascos le daban a uno por el pecho, en la cabeza. Sin embargo, no éramos ajenos al tema político, a lo que sucedía en la capital. Poco a poco fue permeabilizando también la situación aquí en el departamento y se da, digamos, un entusiasmo y un fervor de cambio abrigado en la posibilidad de triunfo de la Unión Nacional Opositora encabezada por Duarte, que a la larga fracasó debido a que
En el periodo la dictadura militar no permitía la llegada de civiles.
Si uno votaba por el partido de la pescada, conciliación, partido de conciliación, los orejas que andaban allí, lo llamaban a uno al cuartel allá a interrogarlo, y que le iban a ampar preso, y que no sé qué nomás.
Porque el que era militante de ese partido era enemigo para el partido oficial.
Pero yo diría que el 72 en Jopaitique marca como el fin del entusiasmo por las elecciones. Que me capturaron por terrorista, porque la gente se agrupó, no durmió la gente, como 300, 400 gente alrededor de la cárcel. Y entonces optaron por llevarme a San Miguel.
A partir de las prédicas de la teología de la liberación, la iglesia salvadoreña comenzó a transformarse hacia una opción a favor de los pobres. Se crearon centros de formación campesina como la del Castaño en el departamento de San Miguel, en donde los campesinos iban a hacer estudios bíblicos. Ahí en ese lugar se fomentaba también la creación de cooperativas y se analizaba la realidad política y social de El Salvador. De esa manera realizaban una crítica a las estructuras del poder y el papel tradicional que había tenido hasta ese momento la iglesia. Es entonces que unos 30 campesinos más o menos del norte del Morazán se formaron como catequistas asistiendo a este centro del Castaño de San Miguel.
Las cosas son así. Si el sacerdote de Jopaitique, el padre Arqueta, nos mandaba, era para continuar el religiosismo, ¿verdad? Pero allá en Castaño fue diferente. Allá habían sacerdotes diferentes, ya no era como el padre Arqueta. Entonces allí fue donde hubo ya un desprendimiento del religiosismo con la vida social. Y en esta vida social nosotros nos empapamos a hacer como la Biblia dice.
Y por el acercamiento que tenía con la iglesia, me dieron la oportunidad de estudiar un curso al Castaño. Y en el Castaño, a través de los cursos, a través de estudios, seguimos conociendo la liberación del hombre integral.
¿Cómo nosotros como iglesia pues, podíamos participar en este proceso, verdad? Que se empezaba en ese momento a ir deslumbrando.
Al campesino, a nosotros nos iban explicando de cómo habían vivido los primeros cristianos, ejemplito. Y como nosotros sí, el Padre nos ha dicho que la Biblia es verdad, pues. ¿Ah? Que los primeros cristianos compartían y vivían en comunidad, pues, en Hechos 4:32.
Para 1973 llegó a Morazán un joven sacerdote, Miguel Ventura, que seguía la línea de la teología de la liberación. Este jugó un papel importante en fortalecer las comunidades eclesiales de base.
Miguel Ventura fue una de las personas que se sacrificaron mucho, ¿verdad? Manera de concientización con las comunidades en cuanto a lo que eran los valores cristianos, los valores humanos.
En ese marco, pues, las comunidades del norte de Morazán, concretamente en Torola, comenzaron una experiencia de vida muy comunitaria, muy colectiva, muy asociativa. Entonces, los catequistas, que eran como los líderes naturales en cada una de las comunidades, se reunían también conmigo cada mes para evaluar el trabajo que realizábamos y tener también jornadas de formación en la perspectiva de la teología de la liberación.
Nosotros andábamos como que fuéramos como un redil, ¿verdad? Donde iban los orientadores, catequistas, íbamos todos, y si algo le pasaba a alguien, pues todos estábamos pendientes de eso, nos protegíamos.
Se da origen a las comunidades eclesiales de base, que en su toma de conciencia generan algunas experiencias que pueden ser, digamos, la posibilidad de una nueva forma de vida que se puede asumir acá, y el trabajo en colectivo. Se dan algunas experiencias en el Cantón El Progreso de Torola, y en el caserío Santa Anita de Jocuaitique, en donde se unen campesinos que tienen tierra con otros que no la tienen y hacen un trabajo colectivo y comparten las utilidades de esos bienes.
Vaya, por ejemplo, con lo de los trabajos, empezaron a unirse, a buscar la unidad, que cuando a alguien le faltaba que se pueda su milpa, pues empezaron la organización a que un grupo iba un día donde uno, un día donde el otro, así empezaron. Y que después ya se hizo colectivo una milpa grande. Que los Hernández, una familia Hernández que tenía posibilidades de terreno, dio sus tierras, pues, para que la gente cultivara ahí, y ya cuando la cosecha ya estaba, ya se repartía, ¿verdad? Ya se repartía entre todos los que habían trabajado, y a veces se le daban hasta los que no habían trabajado también, porque eso era lo que se buscaba, ir mejorando la calidad de vida.
Nos gustaba mucho para eso de compartir, porque no se hablaba de que había que compartir lo que se trabajaba. Trabajábamos y al final de la cosecha se repartía lo que se cosechaba.
Entonces salíamos de lo mío y los pasábamos al otro. Salíamos de aquel y los pasábamos al otro. Salíamos del otro hasta que sacudíamos todo el vallecito de Totolico. No sentíamos las limpias de las milpas, porque todos éramos unidos, todos bien unidos.
Ellos, los que trabajaban en las milpas, en las frijoleras, era un grupo que se mantenía todos juntos, trabajando socialmente, y yo haciendo las viviendas, y sin ganar ni un centavo. Entonces era un trabajo muy excelente, para mí fue muy excelente.
Entonces la gente empezó a entender que teníamos que, el punto central de conversión fue el amor hacia el prójimo, y nos explicaban que el prójimo era el más desposeído, el necesitado, el anciano, el niño. Eso nos hizo, no perfecto, pero nos hizo crear la persona nueva, pues. Que fueron las ideas quizás que a muchos nos motivaron, porque se estaba hablando de un cambio, no como la iglesia lo dice, de que va al cielo, sino que había que construir una sociedad diferente, empezando desde la familia, porque el mismo sistema nos tenía a nosotros dormidos de diferentes formas, ¿no? El guaro, el alcohol, el odio, la gente que peleaba por un pedacito de tierra, y no darse cuenta de que quién era el culpable principal son los que tenían el poder.
La vagancia, los bailes, el alcoholismo, teníamos que ir cambiando ya la situación del respeto al esposo, olvidábamos hasta de las demás amistades que teníamos antes, todo eso aglutinó bastante gente.
Porque la gente que atendió el llamado cambió su forma de ser, porque en lo personal yo le diría, yo tenía un marido era bolo, celoso, que llegaba momentos que por milagro estoy aquí, ¿verdad? Pero cuando empezó la organización y los mensajes, él cambió bastante.
La mayoría de la gente que ahí éramos familia, si se organizaba uno, comenzaba a organizar el resto de familia.
Porque se incorporó el viejito, luego iban los hijos, luego los sobrinos, luego los primos. Aquí fue familiar. Nosotros teníamos un concepto, que cuando ganábamos un muchacho de una familia que eran 10 hermanos, ya sabíamos que todos, y que hasta los primos venían.
Este esfuerzo de organización se ve enfrentado a la iglesia tradicional, esencialmente espiritual, ¿verdad? Que aboga por la adoración más que todo a los santos, que está muy ligada al pensamiento conservador del gobierno, que conjuntamente con los aparatos paramilitares, como es el caso de orden, empiezan a hacer dificultoso el trabajo de estas organizaciones que acá se conocieron como los grupos.
Y por otro lado estaba la parte de la iglesia tradicional que también declaradamente fue oposición, pues. Aquí tenemos el padre Argueta, una vez trajo un cura de Chalatenango reaccionario, Carlos Moreira, a que viniera a intimidarnos a santanitas, pues, donde un grupo de catequistas se enfrentaron en debate bíblico y la cosa no pasó, no quedó allí porque nosotros siempre seguimos porque entendimos que estábamos en lo correcto.
Lástima que se vino la represión. Cuando el padre Argueta empezó a denunciarnos a nosotros, que nosotros éramos comunistas, ya no pudimos trabajar abiertamente. Ya no podíamos ser un grupo social.
Nos llevaban de aquí personas a un, como le quiero decir, como hacer retiros allá por un lugar del Castaño. Allá llevaban a aprender a inyectar, decían que lo llevaban, ¿verdad? Pero allá les metían otra ideología a las personas, porque dijeron que había una reunión de catequesis. Vamos. No, pero ya él en la catequesis ya metió otras cosas, ¿verdad?
¿Cómo qué?
Ajá, como vaya, diciendo de que debíamos de unirlos para cualquier, que ya la guardia o la policía de Hacienda ya son ya oponentes de la autoridad. Eso no me gustó a mí.
Lo que la gente decía era que nosotros casi los habían engañado allí pues con la Biblia, ¿verdad? Que los habían engañado con los mensajes. Pues nosotros creíamos que el mensaje era que íbamos a dar la doctrina a la gente, a enseñarle las palabras de Dios a la gente después, pues, pero que no nos dijeron de que nosotros realmente los iba a tocar enfrentarlos con la Fuerza Armada. Vaya, si los hubieran dicho de un solo, miren hermanos, nosotros vamos a ser perseguidos por la Fuerza Armada y ustedes pónganse alerta, el que tenga una armita, prepárense porque el enemigo los va a perseguir a ustedes y ustedes no se van a dejar de ellos. Pero no, fue bien lentamente, esa parte ahí fue bien lenta, pues no los explicaron nada.
Decían que ellos eran, en el tiempo les decían ellos buchicheros, ¿verdad? O buscapleitos, pero realmente ellos eran gente trabajadora, ¿verdad?
En las celebraciones había mucha gente. Habían también personas que estaban en el ejército, en el cuartel. Se venían, cada uno andaba con su mochilita porque nadie era del lugar de origen. Y adentro de la mochila andaban sus cassettes para grabar, sus grabadoras. Y de allí fue donde se fue comenzando la represión porque ellos llevaban eso al cuartel, lo que escuchaban de toda la gente.
Y al siguiente año, en 1974, visitó a Morazán el estudiante universitario Rafael Arcesabla, un joven dirigente del Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, que en 1971 había integrado un pequeño grupo, en su mayoría universitarios.
Arcesabla vino a Torola como acordate de que el camuflaje era que Arcesabla era seminarista y que era familia del padre Miguel, sobrino, decía. Así se manejó pues la leyenda.
Me hizo varias visitas y al final pues después de haber dialogado amplio, a fondo sobre la posibilidad de estructurar este movimiento en Morazán, un movimiento ya con la dimensión político-militar, yo le planteé que no era yo quien iba a tomar la decisión por toda una población. Esa reunión, lo que fue a mediados de 1974. Y efectivamente, después de esa jornada, ¿verdad?, ellos regresaron a sus comunidades. Yo después les pregunté qué les había parecido y todos estuvieron de acuerdo.
Rafael Arcesabla nos decía, miren, ustedes tienen que armarse, ustedes tienen que buscar otro rumbo, no ser comunidad, así simple comunidad. Bueno, nosotros lo que pensamos es liberar al pueblo. Nosotros estamos dispuestos a lo que nos toque.
Porque yo lo que estaba en contra era de las Fuerzas Armadas, de lo que estaba haciendo la guardia, la policía. Eso no, Dios no lo permitía, que esa lucha que ellos traían de venir matando a la gente. Y nosotros, ¿qué queríamos? Levantarlos como en defensa del pueblo.
Hasta este momento, los campesinos todavía no habían experimentado la represión por su participación en las comunidades cristianas. La decisión de algunos de incorporarse a la lucha armada fue más que todo basado en varios factores. Uno, por ejemplo, la marginación social. Otra, los abusos y amenazas de las dictaduras militares. Y una que es muy importante, el cierre de la vía electoral como vía de transformación social.
Y cuando los catequistas recibieron el planteamiento de lucha político-militar, lucha armada, su preocupación no fue que estuviéramos negando a Dios, o su preocupación no fue el que se tuviera que matar a otra persona. Más bien la preocupación en todo el contexto de organización revolucionaria es que algunos compañeros planteaban cosas como que la familia es una institución burguesa, ¿verdad? Entonces, eso me lo expresaron los catequistas. En muchas cosas estamos de acuerdo, me decían, pero esto no lo aceptamos.
Por eso aquí hubo un problema cuando alguien decía Dios no existe, tenía controversia, pues. No había que parar a discutir eso, pues. No, que había que buscar, porque claro, en la lucha aquí se metió gente que no sabe de Biblia.
Teníamos el concepto de que el comunismo era ateo, que nos iba a quitar las creencias a nosotros y cómo darle de paso.
Entonces, y así va como nosotros fuimos organizando a la gente. Pero cuando ya agarramos los primeros fusiles de palo, tuvimos que dejar la vida para ya ir golpeando al enemigo.
En esta explicación, que había que unir, trabajar unidos, compartir las cosas. Yo casi también así de acuerdo a compartir las cosas no estaba, pues. Estaba más de acuerdo a organizar para empujar una lucha, pues, ¿verdad? Y yo el grito lo agarré, pues.
O sea que dentro de las reuniones de rebelión que tuve yo, se planteaba de cómo podíamos nosotros convencer a los ricos para que fueran más justos con los trabajadores, ¿va? Algunos decían que yendo con la Biblia, y hubo quien dijo no, a ver que afilar el corvo.
Porque mi mamá, como ella se incorporó con los catequistas, todos nosotros los incorporamos y entrenamos con armas de palo, con fusiles de palo. Y entonces cuando a los 2 días que yo aparecí aquí a la casa de mi mamá fue a gestionarme quién andaba yo y quién andábamos nosotros, que por nosotros lo iban a matar a ellos. Y yo tuve que decirle la verdad a ellos, que nosotros no éramos, ya no íbamos a estar con ella, no íbamos a trabajar a ella, sino que nosotros no hemos creído. Sí. Yo lo tuve que declarar y entonces mi mamá entró en una crisis con nosotros seria, pues que ya no lo quería ver en la casa. A yo y a mi hermano mayor, que ya no los permitía estar en la casa y nosotros ya no veníamos acá tampoco ni a comer.
Esta gente que estaba organizada en comunidades cristianas de base se uniera a la democracia cristiana, ¿va? Porque de allí también podíamos hacer los cambios electorales. Nosotros siempre pensamos en una vía electoral todo en un momento. Siempre pensamos en eso en ese momento.
En ese marco también llegan unas nuevas elecciones en 77. Nuevamente la ONU es desplazada del gobierno por un nuevo fraude. La gente indignada se concentra en la capital y el 28 de febrero del 77 es masacrada la gente que exigía que se respetara la decisión del pueblo depositada en las urnas. Esto llega, digamos, al agotamiento de la posibilidad de cambio que abrigaba mucha gente en el departamento de la vía electoral como una forma de alcanzar un gobierno de carácter democrático que hiciera los cambios que necesitaba.
Seguimos siempre con la esperanza de los cambios, que fue ya lo del 77 cuando entró la monja. Y fue más duro todavía por esa masacre del 28 de febrero. Y cuando decían que lo habían disfrazado con agua, y era mentira, y no que les lavaban con agua, pero la sangre de los mártires en esa plaza Libertad. Entonces, para nosotros eso era duro ya, ¿va? Porque sabíamos que ya las elecciones ya no eran la solución.
1977, el 3 de noviembre, pues capturan a Miguel Ventura y asesinan a Juan Ramón Sánchez, ahí en el desvío de Ocicala, que él venía con los afiches que repartíamos a la gente. Eran de las LP28. Después de eso, ya no se pudo ir a celebrar a ningún lado.
Okay, up to there. Thanks. Okay, I just want to remind people, this is very much a work in progress, a rough cut, but it did look like the subtitles worked out more or less, so that's good. The problems of documentary filmmaking and historical analysis are closely related to scholarly work on oral history and collective memory. My brief reflections on this film, La Palabra en el Bosque, relate to this larger framework and its potential implications for the theme of the panel, collective memory and human rights. La Palabra en el Bosque purports to tell the stories of some peasants in Morazan during the 1970s to a primarily, though not exclusively, Salvadoran audience. The most intractable problem inherent in this undertaking is how to historically contextualize testimonies of the protagonists without denigrating their intrinsic value. Put differently, if we recognize in the words of Paula Rabinowitz that testimonies are, quote, a supplementary gesture towards truth, unquote, how does one visibly critique them without engaging in symbolic violence, the imposition of categories and perception on those with limited cultural capital? As you can see in the beginning of the rough cut, peasants in Morazan participated in collective farming on land donated by community members. Following the historian Jay Winter, I would call these efforts minor utopian experiments. Quote, imaginings of liberation, usually on a smaller scale, without the grandiose pretensions of the almost unimaginable hubris and cruelties of the major utopian projects, unquote. In Latin America and elsewhere, these visions of partial transformation, of, quote, pathways out of the ravages of war or away from the indignities of the abuse of human rights, unquote, were often embedded within a major revolutionary utopian discourse. An estimated 1/3 of the population of northern Morazan, 55,000 in total, joined the Comunidades Eclesiales de Base, which I'm going to call Christian-based communities or CEBs. By the late 1970s, most of those activists had joined either the guerrilla organization, El Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, or ERP, or its mass organization, Las Ligas Populares 28 de Febrero. By the early 1980s, northern Morazan was a, quote, liberated zone controlled by the FMLN, composed of the ERP and 4 other guerrilla groups. Most of the former CEB activists who became guerrillas present a linear narrative about the growth of the guerrilla movement. The state repressed the CEBs, the Christian-based communities, and militants joined the ERP to combat the authorities. Further state terror caused masses of peasants to join the ERP's sponsored Ligas Populares, popular leagues, who then responded to further jailings, tortures, and killings by joining the ERP and launching the revolutionary struggle. Within the film, we suggest an alternative narrative without performing an overt critique of the informants. We do this by allowing the ambivalence of some testimony to purposefully leave open interpretive possibilities. And there's a bit in this and much more later in the film. Why did some 30 catechists join the ERP in 1974 and 1975, despite the lack of direct repression against the CEBs at that time? Access to the decision-making process in 1974 is obscured by the compression and accentuation of historical time induced by the revolutionary mobilization of 1977 to 1980. In late 1977, a cycle of repression commenced that was so intense, brutal, and arbitrary that an objective reassessment of the 1974 decision is extremely problematic. The cold fury directed at the National Guard and paramilitaries by the late 70s colored the moment when the campesinos opted to join the ERP. They thus attribute their initial adhesion to the ERP to local repression, even though, as I mentioned, CEB activists had suffered neither arrests nor tortures at that moment. Moreover, subsequent militancy in the ERP with its associated Leninist teleology sharply influenced their view of their prior participation in the CEBs as something good but primitive. As we saw in the rough cut, those who joined the ERP resigned as catechists and began to view their former hermanos with a degree of condescension, using the language of commitment levels to denote their superiority, such as novo. Quote, I didn't agree very much with that explanation that you had to unite, work together, share things. I agreed more with the necessity to start a struggle. I caught on quickly. At the same time, many peasants remained in the CEBs, and they were the ones whom state and military and paramilitary repression after November 1977 pushed into Las Ligas and then the ERP. Thus, the latter developments provided significant historical and memory material for the narrative of repression as the cause for the destruction of the CEBs and the creation of the guerrilla army. Daniel James's analysis of Peronist meatpackers' displacement of the events of October 17th onto October 16th of 1945 is apposite. Due to the collective necessity to maintain the memory of the nonviolent, harmonious nature of October 17th, the day that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Argentine workers pressured the regime to liberate Perón, informants pushed back street confrontation with anti-Peronists to the previous day. Quote, yet their memories are both individual in that they are rooted in personal recall and the need to establish personal identity and life story coherence, and also profoundly shaped by criteria drawn from the needs and desires of their particular collectivity. By underscoring the importance of timing and memory, we are entering highly contentious terrain. The scholars David Stoll, Yves Lebeau, and Yvonne Grenier dispute the inevitability of civil war in Central America, blaming the revolutionary left for manipulating workers and peasants into armed confrontations with the state. They argue that the guerrillas in Guatemala and El Salvador, due to their ideological commitment, provoked military repression, thereby compelling peasants to choose sides between the two demons, the army or the guerrillas. The Morazan case, on the surface, might offer this revisionist school an evidentiary base. The repression only came to Morazan after the ERP had made its presence felt. Yet the two demons thesis ultimately does not describe the history of Morazan because it fails to grasp how peasants consciously assumed their responsibility and commitment to the guerrilla forces, a decision that was prior to violent repression. Moreover, until 1981, virtually all of the ERP activists in the area were local peasants, some of whom attained leadership positions. Notions of the inevitability of armed conflict did, however, inform left perspectives. Michel Roth-Trouillot remarked apropos of the Haitian Revolution, quote, effective silencing does not require a conspiracy, not even a political consensus, unquote. A retrospective consensus did emerge on the left that peaceful change was impossible during the 1970s, and military repression of all forms of independent peasant and labor organization was inevitable. State repression made such readings convincing for activists at all levels. In 1972 and 1977, electoral fraud with accompanying violent repression of protests effectively closed off any peaceful route for change. Yet the period following the military coup of October 1979 remains problematic. There is no doubt that revolutionary left activists, to some degree, feared that the civilian military junta that came to power, including moderate leftists, could carry out its program of structural reform and thereby debilitate the revolutionary left's political base. Whether or not there was a real chance for a successful center-left alliance against the terrorist cum oligarchic alliance, Morazan peasant activists, due to their immersion in what amounted to a local civil war with Orden, the paramilitaries, maintained few doubts about their own role in opposing that junta in 1979. During the 1970s, left militants made decisions based on a reasonable expectation of violent state repression. Those decisions had immediate consequences. The catechists who joined the ERP in 1974 and 1975 consciously neglected a local experiment that hinged on a unique sense of community. focused on strategic goals, left militants generally failed to appreciate the new society emerging in the villages and hamlets. Ironically, the left, broadly defined, had long promoted notions of modernity and solidarity that were at the core of the Morazan communities. Yet the death squads of 1980 annihilated those communities, their values, and crucial dimensions of their collective memories. In addition to the contextualization of testimony, omniscient narration is another potential realm of symbolic violence in that it creates both a sense of authorial or directorial, I don't know what the right word here is, superiority over the film's subjects and a false sense of the fixity of historical interpretation. Our first film, The Scars of Memory, dealt with the 1932 massacre of some 10,000 Salvadorans, the majority of whom were Indians. We experimented in vain to avoid the use of an omniscient narrator. Due to different forms of traumatized memory, all but one of over 200 informants whom I interviewed suppressed indigenous agency in their accounts of the January 32 insurrection that preceded the massacre. In other words, virtually all of the people I interviewed didn't accept the fact that they or other indigenous people had directly participated in the insurrection. Indigenous survivors of the massacre and their offspring blame the insurrection on the Ladino or non-Indian other, despite overwhelming documentary evidence that thousands of indigenous people did rise up against the military and political authorities. To narrate that film directly through the informants, therefore, would have impeded any reasonable assessment of the historical record. To deconstruct the traumatized memory of the narrator or participants would have made the film overly complex, as well as inflict a form of symbolic violence that we wish to avoid. With La Palabra en el Bosque, once again, we have tried to avoid the use of the omniscient narrator, and basically came to a compromise, and you could see more at the beginning that the narrator, Colleen, a rural school teacher, is talking to his classroom. And the narration is really a joint project between us, but one that's not ideal. I can talk about that later. But by and large, it's a better solution than omniscient narration. Let me try and summarize some methodological points. The task of memory work, creating the conditions for people to express their own stories about human rights abuses, social struggles, or for that matter, fear or apathy, should be a challenge and responsibility for any students and scholars who work on the contemporary history of Latin America. Yet there are also pitfalls about which we should remain vigilant. Once the oral historian or documentary filmmaker uncovers the contradictory nature of a given historical process, then the question remains what to do about it. We share with a growing number of scholars the desire to return our work to its community of origin, as we did with our documentary on the 1932 massacre. Yet to produce a documentary which emphasizes, in this case, that peasant militants created a collective narrative that in crucial moments departs from the historical record would at once be intellectually arrogant and counterproductive. I do want to clarify that the time displacement is not necessarily due to traumatized memory, much less conscious manipulation by leftist militants. Rather, as suggested above, we are dealing with a community memory that evolved over time, one that has its basis in fact as well as in certain ideological prejudices that favored a seamless story of popular empowerment and courage through armed struggle. Within the limits that narrative coherence allows, through the expression of ambivalences, we try to leave open the possibility of alternative interpretations for the transformation of the CEBs into a base for the FMLN. Although I have stressed the difficulties inherent in combining historical and documentary film work, I would like to close on a more optimistic note. First, video-recorded interviews offer a supplement to oral historical research in that one can analyze the semiotics of facial and bodily gestures, allowing the historian greater interpretive reach. Finally, as many scholars have pointed out, the reverberations between past and present form a subject of intrinsic interest and importance. The documentary filmmaker is in an advantageous position to both study and highlight those reverberations. The film emphasizes the utopian aspects of the Christian-based communities, their highly developed communitarian and egalitarian qualities, more than the heroism of the guerrillas. In so doing, it suggests that those roots are perhaps most compelling today, in a world where utopian thought and deep collective experiences have been banished to a dustbin marked archaic. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Professor Elizabeth Oglesby, and she's going to talk about violence and the politics of memory, notes from Guatemala. She has conducted research in rural Guatemala since 1986. She was a researcher with the Association for the Advancement of the Social Sciences in Guatemala, editor of the Central America Report, published by Infront Press, and associate editor of the Report of the Americas, published by the North American Congress on Latin America. From 1997 to 1999, she was a consultant to the Guatemalan Commission for Historical Clarification and Guatemala's Truth Commission, and a member of the writing team of the CAH final report. She has received research grants and fellowships from the National Science Foundation, Social Science Research Council, and Woodrow Wilson Foundation. She has published numerous articles on Central American development politics, state violence, historical memory, refugees, and migrations. Welcome.
Well, thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me. I'm truly honored to be part of this event, and I'm glad to finally be here. I bring solidarity from people in southern Arizona for the struggle of people here in Ohio to protect your collective bargaining rights. And please send good thoughts to us in southern Arizona as we try to separate ourselves from the racist craziness in Phoenix. Yeah. I'd like to make some brief remarks today about social memory in Guatemala and hopefully lead to a discussion with all of you. Exactly 2 years ago, I was in Guatemala for the 10th anniversary of the publication of Guatemala's Truth Commission report. There was a big symposium in the atrium of the old National Palace, the former nerve center of Guatemala's repressive counterinsurgency war. All of the country's human rights groups were present to discuss the impact of the Truth Commission in Guatemala. The Truth Commission had been set up as part of the peace process in the 1990s, and under the auspices of the United Nations, it published its report in 1999. At this anniversary symposium in 2009, there was a large banner calling for the recovery of historical memory. The image on this banner was of a graveyard of crosses marked XX, symbolizing the massacres that occurred in Guatemala in 1982. Certainly, because of the Truth Commission and many other social memory projects in Guatemala, it was possible in 2009 to talk about the massacres in ways that were only beginning in 1999 and couldn't have been said at all in 1989. But this image made me think, why is historical memory in Guatemala, and indeed in post-war or post-authoritarian Latin America in general in many places, conflated to mean histories of violence and victimization? Why not use as an image to represent historical memory an image that captures what people were struggling for, sort of like what you're doing now in this wonderful film? What was it all about? What's at stake in this remembrance? These are some of the questions that I want to try to explore today. Ultimately, I want to argue that this conflation of historical memory with histories of violence and victimization is not only sketchy history, but is detrimental to long-term processes of social reconciliation. Oops. Okay, just a little bit of the basic parameters of the conflict in Guatemala, especially if there are students in the audience. Guatemala had a long period of armed conflict that dates to the early 1960s. There were many different kinds of victims during the course of this conflict, from urban professionals and unionists to the cruelest period in the early 1980s, which was the period of the scorched earth, rural counterinsurgency and massacres, during which period the victims were primarily Mayan Indians, Mayan indigenous groups. This is a map from the Guatemalan Truth Commission report that shows the shaded areas where the massacres took place in Guatemala in the early 1980s. The shaded areas, of course, roughly correspond to the indigenous areas of highland Guatemala. All total, the Truth Commission documented over 600 massacres during this period in Guatemala. The Truth Commission determined that the overwhelming responsibility for human rights violations during the period of the armed conflict in Guatemala was attributed to the Guatemalan state, over 90% of the human rights violations. So although we talk about a civil war, we talk about an armed conflict, what was really going on was a campaign of state repression against a whole range of social movements in Guatemala. And I know many of you have experienced directly with that period. But for those of you who maybe are just studying Central America for the first time, let me just take a moment to talk about what it was like in the 1980s to try to document the counterinsurgency and the scorched earth. And what I want to do is try to periodize what has gone on in Guatemala in terms of different phases of social memory reconstruction. In the 1980s, Guatemala had a different character than El Salvador, than other parts of Latin America that were going through political violence. I would say in that civil society and the social movements faced an overwhelming defeat in Guatemala. So there were very few functioning social movements in Guatemala up until maybe the late 1980s. There was no human rights office like the Vicaria in Chile. The URNG in Guatemala had been beaten back much more thoroughly than the FMLN in El Salvador. There were not the more open spaces in Guatemala that there might have been in El Salvador to talk about what had gone on. Many people faced the consequences of the repression of that period individually because there were very few collective spaces to talk about what had happened. This is a photograph, actually, of Guatemalan refugees in a camp in Mexico in 1982. And I would say the first phase, really, of starting to reconstruct the history of what went on during the counterinsurgency scorched earth period in Guatemala begins with the refugees and the displaced populations, because they are outside of the pervasive military control that was going on in the rural areas during the 1980s. The refugees are in camps in Mexico. The internally displaced are up in the mountains in the communities of population and resistance. And so they are the first ones that talk about the history of the massacres. The refugees and displaced are some of the first groups that start to talk about returning to Guatemala and demilitarizing rural Guatemala. So some of those first efforts to try and open up the history of what happened, I think, start in the 1980s. They start from the victims themselves, family members have disappeared, refugees, displaced populations. There's a second phase that starts with the peace process in the early 1990s, second phase of memory reconstruction. And this is a more institutional phase. The Catholic Church in the mid-1990s begins its Recovery of Historical Memory project. The peace accords start to be signed. One of the peace accords establishes the Commission for Historical Clarification that will be charged with writing a report to document the human rights violations and crimes of war that went on during the armed conflict. So this is a second, more institutional phase. And I think in a context like Guatemala, where it was extremely dangerous to publicly raise the issues of human rights violations, the Truth Commission established some firm ground to discuss the recent past. It's impossible now in Guatemala to deny certain realities, even if the interpretation of history is contested. One of the Truth Commission report's more forceful aspects was the ruling of genocide. And I can speak more about the genocide determination if we have time in the question and answer period. Another important aspect of the Guatemalan Truth Commission report was the inclusion of an historical analysis that was supposed to interpret the causes of the conflict, a very complex endeavor within the Commission. A key issue that was deliberated within the Commission was whether the conflict should be framed as a conflagration between two armed groups, the army and the insurgents, as uneven as that matchup was, or whether the historical analysis needed to be broadened to include other sectors, political parties, elites, social movements. And as we heard in Jeff's presentation, this first interpretation is known in Latin America as the theory of the two devils, or the two fires, or simply the theory of the sandwich, whereby the bulk of the population is caught rather passively in between. At stake in these debates over how to frame this question is not only that other social actors were involved in the conflict, but also that people have identities as historical actors beyond their identity as victims of human rights violations. It's not just that people suffered atrocities, but that they were targeted in the majority of cases because they were members of social organizations, peasant leagues, progressive church groups, unions, student groups, and so on. The Truth Commission report was clear on these points and stressed how multiple social movements evolved and the disproportionate response of the state to these movements, painting the conflict in broad yet grounded terms, trying to avoid both the sterile two devils thesis and the equally useless slippery slope of we were all responsible. Now, just to move us forward a little bit, in the case of Guatemala, the CEH produced a 12-volume report that's inaccessible to most people. So its material has to be interpreted. Which portions of the report are seized upon by diverse sectors for their own political projects, and which portions of this history are muted, and why does it matter? The Truth Commission was dissolved the day the report was presented. This is one of the problems of Truth Commissions, is that in general there's no formal follow-up. The Guatemalan state never assumed ownership of the Truth Commission report or its list of recommendations. In part because of the weakness of the state's involvement, what we saw in Guatemala after 1999 was a new battleground of sorts over these memory initiatives. There are multiple memory projects going on in Guatemala today. Forensic anthropologists continue to exhume mass graves in the highlands. Some of these massacre cases are being presented in genocide trials. Social organizations have organized memorials of different types, like this memorial of a 1982 massacre in the highland town of Rabinal. The Truth Commission report helped to bolster these efforts. I've been interested in how social memory projects have impacted understandings of recent history in Guatemala, especially within the educational system. Since the peace accords, all of the leading school textbooks address the conflict to some degree, even if it's just a superficial mention. This is very different from the 1980s and early 1990s, when the war was not even mentioned in school history education. Given the general superficiality of textbooks, teachers in a range of schools have developed informal ways to introduce some of these topics into the curriculum, including theater, debates, creative writing, having students interview a relative or a community member. And I can talk more about this if anyone is interested. Even though the publication of the Truth Commission report helped open up space for schools and teachers, the actual use of the CEH report in schools has been minimal, in large part because the notions of historical memory are conflated to mean simply the grim profile of the violence. Most references to the report of the Truth Commission are brief and limited to the basic data of how many deaths and disappearances the CEH tabulated. The inclusion of material on the war is a brief prelude to a much longer elaboration of other topics related to civic education, citizen formation, and culture of peace. Let me explain here what I mean. Culture of peace educational programs are part of a framework for reconciliation in which people need to figure out how to live with each other in the aftermath of the armed conflict. This is vital. But when this framework is used as a way to understand history, it becomes problematic. In the culture of peace framework, recent history is framed in two ways: as an expose of brutality or as the triumph of democracy. Indeed, the first framing is the hook that moves us along to the second. Democracy, or the limited political democracy of the post-war period, is posited as the opposite of barbarity, and the culture of peace as the opposite of a culture of violence that supposedly caused the conflagration. What I want to do is try to explore the implications of this culture of peace discourse for constructions of historical memory. One of its core problems for understanding history is that this culture of peace framework gives us the impression that the cause of the conflict in Guatemala was a culture of violence, which is a tautological interpretation that obscures more than it illuminates. We could say probably that contemporary Guatemala has a violent culture, but to posit this as the cause of the conflict ignores central issues such as how and why the armed movement began and how repressive practices evolved. A second problem relates not to the teaching of rights per se, but to the narrowing of possibilities for what else can be talked about. You can talk about the war now in Guatemala, which you couldn't really before, but it's still difficult to talk about the specific conflicts that caused the war. Indeed, narratives tend to, in Guatemala, begin precisely where your film clip left off, by beginning with the repression. This redefines the conflict in ways that preclude discussion of the broad social forces aligned on both sides, because the culture of violence is responsible, the deep social and political cleavages, and the diverse forms of social mobilization that the two fires paradigm cannot capture. As several Latin American scholars have argued, the question we should be asking when we look at the politics of memory in Latin America is what happened to the memory of politics? Part of the problem lies in the way in which historical memory itself has been framed in Latin America, which has a particular genealogy linked to the rise of human rights movements that confronted authoritarian regimes in the 1980s and into the 1990s. It also means a certain privileging of direct testimony by victims of human rights violations. These human rights movements did help create political space for victims' movements to emerge, which at the time was a very important thing. Yet the positing of human rights language as a framework for understanding history is deeply problematic. The polarity is between human rights violators on one side and victims on the other, in which victims are depicted as passive beings harmed by the actions of others. In the words of Elizabeth Helene, the victim is never an active agent. These notions of historical memory infrequently take into account broader histories of life that can give a fuller sense of identity to the victims. This critique does not mean that there's a silent majority of ex-revolutionaries out there waiting for a chance to speak out, only that we need to think carefully about how categories can be more fluid than simply talking about using the category victim to talk about this history. In Guatemala, the uncritical equation of historical memory with histories of violence carries the danger of perpetrating racist stereotypes about the past. For example, that Mayan Indians were passive victims of violence, caught between two armies, manipulated by outsiders, or simply savage. These are powerful tropes that persist to this day in Guatemala. In part, these tropes are born of a legacy of racism in the country, but they are reproduced by notions of historical memory that collapse and erase any sense of historical agency, particularly the history of collective politics. In an article called Reconciliation for Realists, Susan Dwyer contends that in the end, what might realistically be asked of reconciliation processes is tolerance for a limited set of public narratives about the past. The culture of peace framework, indeed the conflation of historical memory with histories of violence and victimization, however, displaces historical analysis, expunges alternative narratives with the effect of limiting, not expanding, the options for public discourse about the past. I would argue that we might be entering a third phase in social memory construction in Guatemala, in which, if we look at the second phase in terms of the institutional projects of the Catholic Church Project and the Truth Commission, which provided an umbrella of protection and some institutional space for people to at least be able to talk about the violence that happened. I think people in Guatemala might be building upon those institutional projects to perhaps start some other projects. Many of the protagonists of the revolutionary movement have written autobiographies. Of course, those mostly circulate in the urban areas in the capital. But there are some more local level projects. There are some collaborations between Guatemalan researchers and activists in the rural areas that are very interesting. There are different types of memorials. Actually, a whole younger generation in Guatemala that didn't actually live through the period of the armed conflict as protagonists, but are engaged politically, have become very interested in interviewing the older generation and producing new kinds of materials about that period of the conflict that do begin to give some insight into the life of protagonists and communities, the context in which they lived and acted, as well as some sense of the local histories of the war and the relationship between diverse local conflicts and the national scenario. This, I think, is key. I think it's very incipient in Guatemala. I think the narrative framework of violence and victimization is very strong and very powerful in Guatemala for a number of reasons. But I see maybe some new initiatives that I think give me some hope that there might be a stronger resurrection of the history of social struggle and more sense of, what was it all about, so that maybe the images that we might be left with won't only be of people as victims, but might also be of people as protagonists of their own history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Adrienne Pine. She's an assistant professor of anthropology at American University. She's a self-described militant medical anthropologist who has worked in Honduras, Mexico, Korea, United States, and Egypt. Her latest book is Working Hard, Drinking Hard on Violence and Survival in Honduras. Dr. Pine has worked both outside and inside the academy to effect a more just world. Prior to and following the June 2009 military coup in Honduras, she has collaborated with numerous organizations and individuals to bring international attention to the Honduran struggle to halt the state violence. She has also conducted extensive research on the impact of corporate healthcare and healthcare technologies on labor practices in the U.S. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank Rhonda and Marixa and everyone else who's involved in organizing this fantastic conference. It's such an honor to be here. I also just want to give a shout out to whoever put the flyers in the back there. There's one for taking it to the streets of DC, Days of Action to close the SOA. And since I live in DC and teach at American, we're actually going to be, as part of those Days of Action, we're going to be holding a Latin American Solidarity Conference at American University, hopefully at American University, and that'll be focusing on ending militarization of the Americas. And so I really hope to see some of you there. We're really excited about that development. So I just recently had the honor of co-editing or guest editing the current NACLA report, which is on coups of the 21st century in Latin America. And in editing articles about Honduras and Venezuela and Ecuador and Bolivia and what am I leaving? Well, Haiti, of course. One of the things that we came up with as a conclusion is that coups of the 21st century aren't all that different from coups of the 20th century in a number of ways. First and foremost, that the United States is generally on the wrong side of them, and in the case of Honduras, which is of course my focus, very much on the wrong side. Although we don't have strong evidence that the United States government was involved in the planning of the coup, although certain individuals who have ties to the U.S. government, like Otto Reich, probably were. That said, the United States government did everything to protect the coup and to keep the powers who carried out the coup in place. And one of the primary examples of actors engaged in this effort is Hugo Lawrence, who's the ambassador to Honduras from the United States. One thing that was interesting is that one of the WikiLeaks cables that came out that was from originally dated about a month after the coup, so it was in late July of 2009. It was called Open and Shut, the Case of the Honduran Coup, and it demonstrated that the State Department actually knew very clearly that what had happened was a military coup, that it was illegal, and that there were grave violations of human rights being carried out by the regime. And we subsequently saw in other cables that they knew the nature of these violations, as well as the fact that they knew that violations of laws in terms of mining concessions, et cetera, were being carried forth by the Micheletti regime. So what we discovered is that despite that cable, which wasn't actually written by Lawrence, it was written by two high-ranking members of the Liberal Party who are now considered to be enemies of the resistance, but that's a longer story. But because of that cable, we know very clearly that the United States Department had, or the State Department had no doubt about what had happened, and yet they were acting to preserve what they themselves, in their own analysis, recognized as illegal and unethical and a military coup. And that's an important point, too, because the State Department came up with this arbitrary distinction of a regular coup versus a military coup, which really doesn't make any sense at all. And the argument was that what happened in Honduras wasn't a military coup, even though the military, led by a School of the Americas trained general, carried it out and stopped in a United States Air Force base on the way out of the country, or on the way bringing Manuel Zelaya out of the country. Despite that fact, since they had put a quote-unquote civilian in power, that therefore it wasn't a military coup. And the important part of that, and they took 2 months to recognize even that a coup had taken place. The important part of that is that enabled them to continue sending all the military aid that they had been sending to the same military that carried out the coup and was actively repressing the burgeoning and what was really an amazingly spontaneous resistance movement. So that. And then following that, what the United States government really did to cement the coup was to orchestrate through the NED the elections that happened in November of 2009. These elections were elections that were carried out by the same military that was actively shooting at resistance members, unarmed resistance members, into crowds on a daily and weekly basis under conditions where freedoms of assembly, freedoms of speech, freedoms of the press had been officially revoked, and when the UN, the OAS, the EU, and the Carter Center refused to monitor these elections. So these were completely illegal elections, and they were only legitimated because Hugo Lawrence and the State Department and the NED were actively involved in creating that legitimacy in order that the neoliberal policies of the coup administration could be carried forth with a veneer of democracy. And that veneer of democracy is what Pepe Lobo represents, the current president of Honduras. when I say it was a neoliberal coup, that's really exactly what I mean. Manuel Zelaya had been somewhat, in minor but important ways, threatening the neoliberal logic. He had been increasing the minimum wage in Honduras. He had been struggling to ensure that there would be no more mining concessions, for example. That's one of the things that he said. He was fighting against the privatization of water and lands. He was actually fighting for the redistribution of lands that had been stolen from campesinos and indigenous peoples. And so in this way, he was threatening a predominant neoliberal logic. And in particular, he was working against the privatization of health. And healthcare, of course, is a really important center for revolutionary thought, as Susan was pointing out, and I think as Sandy Smith-Nonini's recent book, Healing the Body Politic, dealing with El Salvador, does a beautiful job of discussing. Also, privatizing education. There's a push right now with the coup government to privatize nearly all of the education system in Honduras, and as a result, there's a huge crackdown, a violent crackdown against teachers who are mobilizing to retain public education, the public education system. This wouldn't have been possible if the government had continued along the trajectory that it was on under Manuel Zelaya, but it is possible today because there's been this total and complete usurpation of even electoral democracy. So one of the things that we see in Honduras is the specter of the 1980s. We see that the people who are in control of the repression are the inheritors and in some cases the exact same people who were in Battalion 316, the infamous death squad that was overseen by John Negroponte, or rather, he helped in the training, John D. Negroponte. And I should say, by the way, that Hugo Lorenz, is really much more John D. Negroponte than he is Bob White, for example. I mean, we're seeing that inheritance in diplomatic policy today. So the Battalion 316 members, like Billy Hoya, who's responsible for countless disappearances and tortures and murders, is now one of the most important businessmen. He owns private security firms. All of the people who came out of Battalion 316, that's what they moved into, is the burgeoning private security interest or industry, which thrives off of this the gang problem, which is, of course, itself a product of counterinsurgency campaigns in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Guatemala. So you have people like Billy Hoya, who was actually directly working for Micheletti, advising him on how to repress the resistance movement, and people like Oscar Alvarez, who's the nephew of Gustavo Alvarez Martinez, who was the leader of Battalion 316, who's now in his second term as Minister of Security, and who's promoting this mano dura, zero-tolerance approach that very much paints the problem as Elizabeth said, a culture of violence that needs to be repressed rather than resistance, rather than an agentive problem that refutes their logic. In the United States, we also have the specter of the 1980s very much present, both in the rhetoric that's used, and that, we still hear the communist menace thing being brought up again and again. But also in the actors, Otto Reich, Negroponte, and then more shadowy institutional figures like Christopher Webster, who's the head of the Central American Division in the State Department, who, these are people who get appointed under the Reagan years or whenever, and then continue with that logic, really controlling policy when, we think of policy often as coming from the officials that we elect, but it actually doesn't work that way in Washington. This is something I've learned a lot from being in Washington. And then, of course, in Washington, we have the even more extreme lobby than these sort of old guard. We have people like Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who illegally went to Honduras because she was consorting with an enemy government, met with Micheletti, had a press conference, held a constitution with him, hugged him, did everything she could to legitimate that administration. And she's also important because of the strong Israel connection. And Israel, as was mentioned earlier, in the wars of the 80s, is currently actively arming and training the paramilitaries and militaries in Honduras, and also in more institutionalized ways, like through SICA, the Central American Integration System, openly training police forces throughout Central America. So, as I mentioned earlier, the resistance came as quite a surprise to just about everybody. And, you know, now in retrospect, a lot of people are saying, oh, well, we knew it was going to happen. But Honduras has a very different history from Nicaragua, from El Salvador, from Guatemala, and, you know, did have some successes in terms of land reform in the 70s, did have important social movements, but they weren't on the level of what we saw in surrounding countries, or at least they were of a sort of different quality. And the 1980s, the Death Squad, Battalion 316, and the Campaign of Terror, and the fact that Honduras was used as the staging ground for interventions, violent interventions of the United States into the neighboring countries, you really did a good job at squelching that, the resistance movement that could have been in Honduras. And one of the things that I wrote about in my book, which was a very sort of frustrated moment for me, is why don't people resist? And, you know, I felt sort of hopeless about it when I published the book in 2008. So it was really thrilling to see the passion with which people came out on the streets on a daily basis, every single day, from June to November, in great numbers, despite the fact that they were being shot at with live ammunition. So let's see, and the response to that, of course, was targeted violence against the resistance movement. In the period of the Micheletti period, or even the early months of it, a variety of international human rights organizations like Amnesty International and the IAHCR counted well over 4,000 human rights abuse. They documented these, including arbitrary detentions, torture, targeted assassinations, and those have continued under the Pepe Lobo regime. We've had already hundreds of political murders under the current regime, which is the supposedly democratic regime that, that is fully supported by the United States government at all levels. So I want to talk a little bit. How much time do I have left? Like 5 minutes? Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, I want to talk about theology and organized religion as a central site of contestation within the resistance. Starting with the fact that the most famous religious figures in Honduras played a really central role in legitimating the coup. The Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez is one of the biggest spokespeople for the coup. He actually came out a day or two before the first widely recognized martyr of the coup was taken, Isidro Obed Murillo. That was on July 5th, 2009, that he was killed. And so the cardinal came out and said, if people protest, there will be a bloodbath. And everybody recognized that as a threat, not just as a statement, but as a threat. He's called the Cardenal in Honduras. And then Evelio Reyes is another big figure. He's one of the most important televangelists in Honduras. Very much, you know, and Pat Robertson also had an important presence in Honduras that was mentioned in the first panel. So these are the most important. I mean, the Cardinal was, you know, in line for the Pope last time around. These are very important figures within their respective churches. And so in July of 2009, there happened to be one of the many delegations that's come through the United States, and in particular in those months, that was going to be in New York. And so I very quickly organized an event at Blue Stockings Bookstore, and, you know, brought all of these great people, Dr. Juan Almendares, Gerardo Torres, you know, a number of activists. And there was a lot of sort of trashing of the church. There was a lot of discussion about how, oh, well, you know, the church has done such a terrible thing here, and, you know, and the evangelicals, and, you know, and all of these people. And what was really kind of, put us all in our place. I wasn't talking, but the people who were in the front, it sort of put everybody in their place. And, I was sort of nodding at it at the time, was a young, well, not young, but, a man who stood up and he spoke in Spanish, and he said, I just want to contest what you're talking about. I'm an evangelical pastor in the Bronx, and we are all in resistance. My parish or my church is in resistance because we recognize that what's happening with the coup is not what Jesus would have wanted, right? This is not an act that would be supported. This is not something God would support. And suddenly when he said that, then all of a sudden everybody, took on their mantle of liberation theologists. It was, well, of course Jesus wouldn't support this, and then they started recognizing that there are really important figures that have been central to the resistance movement in Honduras. And apart from the figures, liberation theology is an ever-present element of the way that people define their resistance. And so there's the bishop in Santa Rosa de Copan. There's Padre Tamayo, who's in exile. There's a really important movement of lay people who work with the Jesuits, etc. There's ERIC, which is a Central American team for research and investigation, and Padre Melo, who I hear that some of you have met before, is one of the important leaders there. There are also a great number of liberation theology-inspired popular education projects, all of this, or a lot of this, coming after the coup, really as part of the what they say is la conciencia me nació de golpe, or, I sort of got by golpe, by a blow, which is the same word as coup in Spanish, I gained my consciousness, and that consciousness is one that's informed very much by liberation theology. So in San Pedro Sula, which is the industrial capital of Honduras to the north coast, there's the Central Park has been renamed Plaza La Libertad, which is a reference to El Salvador, I would imagine. And it's such an interesting transformation of space in religious terms, because this formerly used to be a space where, I would go, and every time I went there, there would be, some lay evangelical preacher preaching stories of individual sin and very individual salvation, and it was very much a narrative, a sort of Protestant ethic narrative of individual hard work will lead you to salvation, and individual recognizing your personal relation with Jesus Christ. And there's been a complete turnaround in the way that the public space is used. What you'll see now, if you see anybody preaching, it's people preaching about the resistance movement, but also it's the Colectivo La Libertad, which consists of, the hot dog vendors and teachers and nurses and the people who are every day in the plaza, who have made it a space of resistance. They have these big speakers, and they're always playing music, and most of the songs have some reference to Christianity and the importance of revolution, or the importance of working beyond. So, No Basta Rezar plays over and over and over again. It's not enough to pray. There are many things we have to do in order to achieve peace. And, there's also a consistent reference to, I know I need to wrap up. Reference to the struggles in other countries. So Monsignor Romero is one of the central figures in the Honduran resistance. So I'll just end briefly with this story then, that dozens of people have told me. The Plaza La Libertad, the Colectivo La Libertad, situates itself on the southern side of Plaza La Libertad, which is facing the cathedral. And the cathedral, unfortunately, identified with the official Catholic Church in Honduras, and so now is seen as a golpista space. So people don't go in the cathedral anymore. And last year, on the 30th anniversary of Monsignor Romero's death, the official Catholic Church wants to claim that anniversary as its own because he has so much symbolic legitimacy. And so they held a mass there. 26 people showed up to that. Outside in the plaza, Padre Melo held a mass, and 1,500 people showed up to that. And it really shows, I think, the importance of religion in people's understanding of what it means to be a revolutionary, what it means to resist the state and violence, and also what it means to work towards something radically different and a society that's much more just. So they're informed by a liberation theology that's Central American, Pan-Latin American, and I think that's one of the real most important lessons that we can learn from this, is that if we're going to be working in solidarity with struggles in Central America, we also need to have that vision of looking at the area as a region, and also stressing that many of the answers we need to be looking for here at home in the United States, given that those are our bullets that are killing people in Central America. So I would echo the call that was mentioned in the first panel to bring the resistance back here and to struggle to liberate the United States as part of the struggle to liberate Central America. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Michael Lee. Professor Michael Lee is Associate Professor of Theology at Fordham University, where he also teaches in its Latin American and Latino Studies Institute. He serves on the governing boards of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States. Dr. Lee researches in the area of Latin American liberation theology, spirituality, and the intersection of religion and politics. His most recent book, the award-winning Bearing the Weight of Salvation, explores the life and theology of Ignacio Ellacuría, university president, theologian, and slain Jesuit priest of El Salvador. Currently, Dr. Lee is editing a translation volume of Ellacuría's major theological essays into English. Welcome. And he's going to talk to us about the tapestry of liberation theology in El Salvador.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to come here. Thank you for the patience. I'm so sorry to have missed the first session where I was scheduled to speak. Weather and airlines conspired against me. So I thank you, the indulgence of my fellow panelists taking away from your discussion time, and for all of you to hear yet another person speak. But perhaps being moved to the second session, I can bring a few ideas together. Because in speaking about liberation theology in El Salvador, you run up against, of course, problems of memory and of narration. Liberation theology, just to talk about it as this singular noun, I mean, what is that? Is liberation theology a doctrine, an idea? Oh, yes, that person ascribes to liberation theology. Is it a monolithic structure? Oh, they belong, they do not belong. Liberation theology is a very complex phenomenon to describe. And so that metaphor as a fabric, as a woven tapestry, when one tries to narrate the story of liberation theology in El Salvador, one has this complex weaving together of stories of people's lives that was so beautifully depicted in the film. And so, you know, I think about in their introduction to liberation theology, the Brazilian theologians Leonardo and Clovis Boff talk about the different levels and the different locations from which liberation theology emerges. And so they talk about popular liberation theology, a pastoral liberation theology, and a professional liberation theology. And while all heuristic schemas have their problems, I find this one is useful and useful to apply to El Salvador because, you know, its story in many ways more well known in the United States than many other Latin American countries, precisely because of names like Jean Donovan, Ida Ford, Maura Clark and Dorothy Kazel, Archbishop Romero, names like the Jesuits of the UCA and Celina and Elba Ramos, of course. And so these were so present because of the U.S. foreign policy debates of the time. And yet, just those names, of course, we know don't do justice to the story of liberation theology in El Salvador. So how to narrate? How to narrate when big names often obscure the very grassroots and the very thickness of a story. I mean, we become used to the notion each year in our own country with a Martin Luther King holiday not to reduce the civil rights movement to one person. So we can say of these martyrs of El Salvador, they who touch upon this much wider story and so many other lives given up, sacrificed in this noble cause of a people's liberation. But to talk about liberation theology and its locations, to talk about a popular liberation theology is at once to narrate the story of somewhere like Morazán. It's to talk about the work of, for instance, Chencho Alas in Suchitoto, or Rutilio Grande, the Jesuit who was assassinated in 1977, and his work in Aguilares and El Paisnal, and the communities that emerged from those, of course. To talk about their work is always to talk about those comunidades de base, those delegates of the word who became catechists, who participated in the campesino education centers, and you have this movement ripple out. So that even in the middle part of the 70s, to have 15,000 catechists educated at these campesino education centers is an amazing nucleus of leaders and of embodied liberation theology. Theology, it's a troublesome word, and I'm in the business. Theologos, it is a word about God. But as we know, every word is more than just spoken. It is practiced, it is lived, it is embodied. And so to talk about, even to talk about a theology, is to talk about this complex network of embodied practices and ideas. Liberation, is it simply a kind of possessive, a liberation of a theology of liberation, much like you'd have a theology of something else? Well, yes and no. To talk about it historically is to delve into what exactly that term means, liberation. And just to use an ecclesial example, you'd go back in the Roman Catholic Church to that amazing event called the Second Vatican Council. And in Gaudium et Spes, its pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, it opens with these amazing words that the hopes, the fears, the anxieties, the griefs of the people of this age, especially the poor, these are the hopes, the joys, the fears, the anxieties of the church. Now, to make a statement like that, I mean, we know statements are worth, well, only so much. But to embody a statement like that about the hopes, fears, anxieties of a people, and to make and to configure a set of practices, what we would call a spirituality, out of it, and then to reflect on that hope summed up in the term liberation. In many senses, it's tough to talk about liberation theology today in the United States because the term liberation doesn't strike much, doesn't capture something. But to talk about liberation as this hope, this alternative, yes, maybe utopia even, and then to ask about, well, what are the embodied practices that would be configured to that end, knowing that ends are most important by the way they configure the path towards them. A theology of liberation. And so that at that landmark meeting of Roman Catholic bishops in Medellin, Colombia in 1968, you have, from the highest magisterial levels, a declaration that poverty, oppression, repression, these are the most important problems in Latin America, and they are what people need and hope for liberation from. And it was just 13 years earlier when the first meeting of the Latin American bishops in Rio took place, and they described the most pressing problem in Latin America as the shortage of priests. What a shift. What a shift. And even in El Salvador, to talk about liberation theology, of course, as we've seen and we've had described from others, is contested space. It is not as if it were any kind of unitary, monolithic movement, and certainly we've seen its critics, and especially its intra-ecclesial critics. One need only look at some of the newspapers, Prensa Gráfica or La Opinión or something like that to see the huge picture of Archbishop Romero and communist bishop or something like that. See editorials signed by the group of Catholic women preserving the faith. These kinds of mysterious groups that would proclaim a faith quite in opposition and in contrast to that being proclaimed and lived in the base communities by men and women, religious and lay. It was funny to see Miguel Ventura, when he was arrested and beaten, Bishop Aparicio said, well, of course, he was arrested and beaten as a man, not as a priest. And it's that dualism, that ability to separate that which is in the sphere of the so-called spiritual, the religious, the holy, from the material, in which the church takes care of souls and the government and military get to rule the rest. This was the theology that conflicted, that tried to repress the theology of liberation emerging from the base communities, and in which we see the commitment of Jean Donovan, Ida, Maura, and Dorothy. They were involved not so much in the earliest phases we might call the conscientization phase, but in what even Jean described in her own letters and diaries as accompaniment, acompañamiento, this accompanying of communities and their sufferings. And as the situation in the country deteriorates from 77, 78, 79, and to that tragic date in December of 1980, as violence increases and the death count rises, you see that frustration, you see that fear, and yet you also see commitment. In just the last month, in October and November of 1980, as Jean is really deciding whether she's even going to stay in El Salvador or not, with so many, she takes a trip away from the country, goes to Ireland and the United States, and so many people are counseling her, don't go back. Be here, get married. There's so many good, you could even work with refugees in Los Angeles. That would be a great thing for you to do. Don't go back there. And yet she couldn't not go back. That sense of commitment, that sense of solidarity had so been part of her work, her practices, her theological understanding that she had become rooted in, that it was impossible for her to stay away. And so to narrate something like martyrdom, which is so complex and so difficult, in the case of Jean Donovan, of Ida Ford, of Maura Clark, of Dorothy Kazel, is to talk about, particularly they as North Americans, is to talk about a solidarity. In theological terms, we call it a kenosis, a self-emptying. It's what the New Testament describes as Jesus, as God becoming human. Kenosis, self-emptying, solidarity. These are keys to narrating this story and these martyrs, as well as others like Oscar Romero, who, through him, we come to see the power of the seat, the archbishopric, put to become the voice of those who had no voice. Such a contested phrase. Why not give the voiceless their own voice, right? Why the powerful archbishop being the voice? And yet when you see it incarnated, it is precisely those voiceless who did gain a voice, gained voice to his office in the droves that they came to speak with him personally, gained a voice in his homilies where he would proclaim everyone disappeared, every violation of human rights. And there we have another kind of narration of that ministry. To that of the UCA, the Jesuit University, and its martyrs in 1989, and how they came to see their own mission as the liberation of the people, but a task, as they described it, done universitariamente, in the manner of a university. Ignacio Ellacuría would tell Jesuit students of his who were frustrated with the classroom and who so dearly wanted to get out into the campo, he would say, you know, we do our work en un escritorio, pero no desde un escritorio. We do our work in a desk, but not from it. He recognized the power of the intellect and the intellectual's work as essential to contributing to the larger vision of liberation, and not to sacrifice that in the name of activism, but to have that rooted in solidarity with those it would purport to serve. So I do want to leave time for us to speak. And so, you know, to think about Jean Donovan and to think about the three companions that she was that she served with, that she was killed with. You know, Margaret Swedish, in her epilogue to Anna Kerrigan's book, Salvador Witness, the one whose research was behind the Roses in December film, she talks about these four churchwomen as the best face of North America during that time, that they serve as a way to redeem that other face, the one of the Reagan State Department, the one that funneled billions of dollars in supporting the Civil War, that these four women put the face of solidarity, of those in North America who committed themselves, and the whole network of solidarity that strove to take as their own this mission and this hope of liberation. You know, reflecting on it and in the face of people like the good cardinal in Honduras, as a Roman Catholic, who struggles with this institutional church today, I see these four women as well as the best face of the church, of what it can be, and how theologos, a word about God that is both spoken and lived in the manner of these women, that is, in the manner of solidarity and of ongoing commitment to whatever the joys, hopes, fears, anxieties of the people of this age, particularly of the poor, that that is their great gift to us. Thank you.
We are going to start the session and answer questions. And if you could please get in line there, those of you who want, and speak to the microphone for everybody to hear. And I'll take this moment. We'll start with my question for the panelists, and on the theme of memory. Because in many ways, the way we remember the past, or memories of these past events, determine what a community or a sector of the community decides was a legitimate behavior in the past. And that also determines what are the legitimate behaviors for political action in the future and in the present. And I would like to ask that question to you. What do you think the way in which these events that you have, all of you have studied, what actions of the past have been declared illegitimate, and what actions for the present cannot be taken, or what is your take on that issue?
I've looked specifically at a couple of projects that come from the powerful sectors like U.S. Agency for International Development, UNESCO, around this idea of the culture of peace. And so I think this is a conscious program to delegitimize protest by equating protest with, you said this too in your presentation, by equating protest with a culture of violence, so that human rights and a culture of peace discourse, while absolutely necessary in a post-conflict situation like Guatemala, necessary for reconciliation, for convivencia, has the effect of being sort of part of a pacification program, or definitely a post-war project of political governance to create new sorts of political subjectivities that focus on individual human rights, but de-emphasize collective rights, de-emphasize the entire history of collective politics.
I guess I could follow up on that. I think that there's a very strong ideology that nonviolence is the right way to approach resistance and protests. And the two problems that I see with this, and I want to make it clear I'm not advocating violence, but to start off with, but the problems I see with that is that, first of all, it's a very limited definition of violence that denies structural violence as such. That is, if you're saying violence is taking up arms to defend yourself against other arms, you're denying the fact that the usurpation of people's lands, that denying them education, that denying them health care is also violence. And so it's a narrowing of the definition of violence that places all the onus on people who may be defending themselves. It also takes away a lot of their agency. But secondly, it creates a situation that makes it really easy to delegitimate a movement by infiltrating them, by creating troublemakers, just as Governor Walker, right. Governor Walker admitted that he had considered doing in Wisconsin. And, so you do see in the case of the Honduran resistance movement, one of the things that the resistance learned quickly that it had to focus on was security within the marches to make sure that they could weed out the police infiltrators who were instigating violence, who were bringing in bombs in their backpacks to make it look like the resistance was carrying out this violence. But at the same time, to go back to the first point, I was in a march on our Labor Day last year, and all of a sudden, we passed the CONADE, which is the National Commissionate for Human Rights, which actually had a huge part in whitewashing the coup, because Ramon Custodio, who's the commissioner, kept claiming that the resistance movement was the violators of human rights and not the other way around. It was an absurd narrative, and he played a role much like the cardinal, and together with the cardinal in many cases, in justifying the violence carried out against the resistance movement. So as we were passing, a number of young men with masks on their faces started throwing rocks at this building. I went into a panic because I thought we were going to get shot at, and then of course that got blown up in the newspapers as, look at how violent the resistance movement is, when they're throwing rocks at a building that people have already known to vacate, and versus a commissioner who's legitimating an incredible campaign of violence that includes murder of, in some cases, these people's family members. So how do you measure violence in that case? I think that that these discourses of what kind of resistance is legitimate, what kind of behavior is legitimate, need to be continually rethought, not in a way that promotes violence at all, but that questions how we've defined violence, and rather includes definitions of structural and symbolic and other kinds of violence as violence, if we're really going to be consistent with that.
Before offering a bit of a response, I don't think I mentioned that I'm co-directing and co-producing that documentary with Carlos Enrique Gonsalve, also known as Santiago. I don't think I mentioned that, and I needed to. In terms of what was considered to be illegitimate activity, I think there was just, within these communities in northern Morazan, the one clearly illegitimate activity was basically spying for the government. And it's interesting because they're within certain paramilitary organizations like Orden, which is the most important one, but also the more importantly, the local patrols, which were organized by the military, I'm still talking about the 1970s, that within those there were many people who at the same time were working with the guerrillas, or the incipient guerrilla movement. And so their status, which from the outside would have looked like completely illegitimate, actually a lot of the people, even the commanders of the local patrols, were fully cooperating with the other side. So that's just an anecdotal side note. But the question about the actual spying for the military or being an oreja is clearly something that was illegitimate, and by 1979, the woman in the film who talks about her husband being so bolo, drunkard, she comments that by 1979, she and others would go around putting notes in the huts of orejas or spies in the area, basically saying, look, you can't stay here anymore in an organized community. That's just not acceptable. So, and either people would leave or have there'd be consequences, violent consequences. I guess, talking about what was then illegitimate activity, what I denote in almost all of the testimonies of people who participated in the communities at the time is clearly a kind of, well, there's obviously a certain amount of nostalgia, but there's also a kind of reflection on how could you have such incredibly intense, coherent communities where everyone, I think it spoke for itself, that how everyone was willing to sacrifice for the other. And what's happened, since the Civil War and today, that intellectually people might want to have the same kind of community, but whatever we want to call the reality of neoliberalism has divided people so much that it's still more of an intellectual goal, even when people come together in Christian-based communities, than possibly having that same level of coherence and solidarity as they did before.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on this notion of nonviolence and memory, and the memory of Archbishop Romero is so contested, so many interests pulling and wanting to co-opt, to own this figure, be it from an institutional hierarchical church that's wrestling whether to canonize him or not and what that might mean, to those who would immediately ascribe to him a kind of facile pacifism when one looks at what he wrote, his third pastoral letter in 78 and the fourth one in 79, but the third one especially, where he takes on the question of violence and goes through the notion of just violence, and especially identifying the root causes, social violence, and this kind of institutional first violence to which people are responding to. So that whole question of Romero and precisely the effects that it has on human agency and resistance and what that means. I see Romero as a real vehicle of that. Even narrating his conversion is a very complex process, but too quickly it becomes this overnight brilliant light that flashes, and a more nuanced contextual reading of even the 3 years prior to his becoming Archbishop in 77, and his contact particularly in Santiago de Maria and the coffee harvesters there, really kind of paints a more complex picture. So in terms of that memory and how so much is being filtered through that figure. Visited a base community where I saw a young man who was born obviously much after the death, the assassination of Archbishop Romero, with a huge tattoo. What is the signification here? What's going on? What is the meaning of this? Or the base community whose youth painted the mural of Romero brandishing a huge sword with all sorts of campesinos behind him, slaying the neck of this dragon whose body became a huge maquila with the label CAFTA written on it. Wow. A fascinating rereading and appropriation of that image.
my main focus of activism for the last few years, I was in Colombia and Central America, and then after 9/11, I became involved with Middle Eastern issues because I also have a lot of friends in the Middle East. And what I'm hearing is a lot, especially in this panel, is a lot of things that could be very valuable for activists on Middle Eastern issues, especially as we see this growing uprising throughout the Middle East. And I see John Negroponte, one of Reagan's killers, still active with Hillary's State Department. John Negroponte is pontificating on democracy and so forth in the Middle East. Here, Otto Reich is still on board. I guess Elliot Abrams is still on probation for the time being. And you also mentioned, and I guess Dr. Pine in particular mentioned the NED. You didn't explain what the NED was, and I think this is also something that would be very valuable for all of the panelists. If you could, your impressions, you've already sort of touched on it, how, what will be the new forms of repression before the next violent repression, the new forms of changing the narrative, of funneling dissent into acceptable channels for the multinational corporations and so forth.
Should I start out with that one? I'm so glad you brought up the Middle East and what's going on in the Middle East, because I actually lived in Cairo for 2 years just before the Honduran coup, and have been watching very closely and seeing a whole lot of similarities, as some of them you've pointed out, in terms of what's going on. The NED, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the National Endowment for Democracy. It's wholly funded by the U.S. Congress, and its two main institutions are the NDI, the National Democratic Institute, and the IRI, the International Republican Institute. Or is that right? Yeah. And these are institutions that carry out projects like the elections in Honduras, which I described to you already, play an important role in some of the more nefarious aspects of U.S. policy internationally. I mentioned the similarities between coups of the past and coups of the present in my talk, but some of the differences that I didn't mention are, I think, something that you bring up and show links between the Latin American contexts and the Middle East, which have to do with the new sort of, Hillary Clinton's favorite phrase of smart power, which is this combination of soft power and hard power. But anyway, this focus on what she calls soft power, in which we're using the neoliberal tool of civil society, quote unquote civil society, which of course doesn't mean civilians or citizens, I should say, doesn't mean citizens as in people who make up a democracy, but it means non-governmental organizations, which is the opposite of something democratic. These are corporate funded organizations that have an agenda that's not accountable to the people. And so what we've got in the United States, in particular, are groups like Freedom House, which is actually a GONGO, a government-organized NGO, because it's, I think, about 90% funded by the State Department. But that organization is working in countries, well, all over the world. One of the main things that it does every year is create a map of the world in which it labels each country as free, partly free, and not free. And there's a great coincidence with the United States State Department's determination of what those are, but then that map gets used in order to determine policy within the Congress. Freedom House has been actively infiltrating or creating sort of working on counterinsurgency movements, I should say, or destabilization campaigns in places like Venezuela and in Egypt. In Egypt, for years before this uprising happened, they had been going into groups that they saw as potential instigators of rebellion and funding them and surreptitiously training some of their members, not all of them, to move them in a less radical, less anti-U.S. direction. So the April 6th movement is one example of that. And I know that because students of mine were involved in it and were horrified to find that Freedom House was pushing it in a much less radical direction. So what we end up with is overthrowing governments, but then an even more neoliberal model that comes afterwards. So, we overthrow, or, the Egyptian people, I should say, overthrow Mubarak, but the way that the NGOs and the Gongos that are doing the work that the CIA used to carry out are trying to engineer it is so that we end up with a government that, again, will receive that $1.5 billion of U.S. aid every year in order to maintain the stability with Israel. And, of course, the Israel connection is key with both the Middle East and with Latin America. When Israel is training and financing much of the paramilitary forces as well as military and police throughout much of Latin America, all of these international policies of violence are very much connected, but also it's I think a real sign that international resistance movements need to be better connected, and that's something I've heard a lot about from Egyptian solidarity activists, is that they're very much inspired by Latin American struggles, and indeed there's a lot of back and forth, there's a lot of dialogue. So I think it would really be great to see more of that, and also to be more cognizant of these international nonprofit organizations, also like the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, for example, that which is closely tied to Freedom House through its board. That are creating destabilization in countries that they don't like, but also destabilizing potentially radical movements, that we need to be aware of how they're operating on an international level in order to work in solidarity with people in any place. Sorry about the length of that.
Anybody wants to speak to it?
Yeah, I might just address the second part of your question about what are the new forms of repression. And I guess I would say the new forms of repression are not very different from the old forms of repression. In that I know what is going on in Guatemala, and I think in other places in Central America, is a resurgence of the kinds of conflicts that we saw in the late 1970s before the civil wars got really bad. Conflicts over land, conflicts over resource rights. So you have conflicts over mining companies in Guatemala and El Salvador. You have the biofuel booms taking off in Central America, causing a new land grab and a resurgence of the old alliance between the landed elite and the death squads, because land has become more important because of biofuels, ethanol, and African palm, and so on, as well as the other resource struggles around oil and mining. So I think what we see is we see formal democracies coexisting with the old forms of repression. For example, in Guatemala, just recently, many of you might know this, martial law was declared in part of the country in the Alta Verapaz region under the guise of the drug war and trying to combat the influence of the Mexican drug cartels that have been active in that region. And what happened during the period of martial law was the kidnapping and murdering of a number of community activists in the Alta Verapaz and Baja Verapaz region who've been activists for a long, long time, struggling against landlords who've been attempting really since the 1970s to take over communal lands in the Verapaz region. So that is going on under the guise of the drug war in Guatemala. So I think a lot of what we saw in the 70s, unfortunately, we're seeing again. And sometimes it's the exact same land conflict in the same place that was active in the 70s and is now hot again, because during the war, the mining companies, the oil companies, they didn't want to invest because the war was going on. But now that the war is not going on, there's an increased interest on the part of multinational corporations and landowners to go back to those same struggles.
If I could just add one more quick thing, is that since you brought that up, the terrorist connection is an important connection. That, you know, the idea of terrorism following 9/11 is used by Latin American leaders in the same way that it's used by people in the United States to justify wars against the Middle East, and even in absurd ways that we've seen in the WikiLeaks cables releases, for example, in Brazil, this idea that the Muslim community in Brazil is going to be the terrorists in for Al-Qaeda in Latin America. There were claims by Oscar Alvarez, the Minister of Security during the Maduro regime in Honduras, that Al-Qaeda was infiltrating through MS-13. And, you know, so labeling gangs as not just terrorists, but of course the Muslim terrorist idea, it was a justification for the wholesale murder of any young men who could be labeled as gang members because they're rendered superfluous in the neoliberal process. And so what we ended up seeing was what I've referred to previously as an invisible genocide, as a slaughtering, the street cleansing of young men throughout, and young women, but particularly young men throughout Central America.
Hello, my name's Bridget Corrigan, and I'm a junior at Magnificat High School. And this is a less intense question than the previous ones, but I was just curious what inspired you to, and sparked your understanding of these movements, and what inspired you to really devote your life and put your passion into, trying to help spread awareness and resolve these conflicts. And then also, I was wondering what you thought maybe my school, my classmates, or I could do to help, become involved and spread the word about what's going on in these countries. Thank you.
It's kind of a it's not a short answer, but I'll make it a real short answer. In my own case, I was involved in various movements in the 1960s, anti-war movement in particular. In fact, I was just thinking of it when we were talking about agents provocateurs, because I can remember it's one of these unwritten about, fairly minor moments in history. There was a rally in New Haven, Connecticut on May Day of 1970, who started out mainly about freeing political prisoners, Black Panthers in particular, and it was a moment in which I belonged to a student group, a fairly radical student group, and our main job was to go around trying to point out agents provocateurs who presumably came from the government, from high up in the government, we thought the army, and try and isolate them in all the demonstrations and point out that people shouldn't follow them. And it was just, it really was a full-time job. It was like 3 or 4 days, and that's all we did. And it seemed like very odd work for student radicals, but that's what we did. So recalling that, so coming out of that, I in the 1970s worked as a union organizer, and it just so happened that at one of the people I tried to organize, I ended up marrying. And the union election was a bust.
She organized you.
She organized me, and she was an immigrant worker from Costa Rica. And so when I got into a mix-up with the union and they fired me, we decided to go visit her family in Costa Rica, and then but this was in 1978, just as the Sandinista revolution was getting going, and that obviously had a huge impact in Costa Rica, and that's how I started out.
I was in a college classroom, and a professor of mine was a visiting professor from Argentina. Well, from Mexico, because he was a liberation theologian from Argentina whose house was bombed, his books burned in the street, Enrique Dusso. And I took a liberation theology seminar from him, and it made me just reassess the whole picture. A friend of mine at the time was actually, she was going on to do repatriation work in Chalatenango. The Civil War was ongoing. And I talked to Enrique about possibly doing that, and he said to me, you know, that's a great thing. But maybe before you go to Latin America, you should get to know the poor of your own country. So I became part of a Catholic worker community. I don't know if you know of Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker. It was in Phoenix, Arizona. And by coincidence, we had, we work with homeless population, but also those who were coming up from Mexico, from Guatemala, from El Salvador. We had one guy who still had a bullet in his hip. And their stories were powerful. And it was there in 1989 that we heard of the assassination of the UCA martyrs, and it left a terribly deep kind of impression. The sanctuary movement and the solidarity networks that were so active, and you kind of get caught up into it. So, going back to school, I had the good fortune to bump into Gustavo Gutierrez, who mentored me, but I would say it was responding to that immediate need. And what's amazing, there was no internet back then. The old phrase still was, think globally, act locally. But I think today there's such an opportunity to do that, where the action can actually be pretty global. The connection can be that much closer. But I would still say rooted in acting as locally as possible, which nurtured and sustained my calling.
I was in college during the mid-1980s when Central America was on the headlines of the newspapers almost every day, although it was more El Salvador and Nicaragua than it was Guatemala. Also very compelled to get involved in Central American activism because of the situation of Central American migrants and refugees coming to this country and not being able to receive political asylum. I was hired by one of my college professors when I graduated college to go be her research assistant in Guatemala to do a research project on repatriation of Guatemalan refugees to see whether it was safe for them to come back to their communities and whether they could get their land back. So I had the chance to travel around rural Guatemala in 1986, 87, 88, 89. And as a foreigner, I was just floored by, it sounds very romanticized, but by the level of hospitality that people gave me who had nothing. The displaced people and the returning refugees, they had nothing. But they would bring you into their house and they would give you what they had. And I think I could do Central American activism for the rest of my life, and I wouldn't be able to make up for the profound human decency and hospitality that people gave to me when I was in Guatemala. So I think that's why. Oh, wait, can I say one more thing? Please. What your more important question, though, is what could you and your classmates do? And I think also, like Michael said, it's important to reach out to your community, and that's something that you probably can do, maybe with the help of some of your teachers. Get to know the Central American community here. Maybe you already do, maybe you're already involved. Why are people coming? What are their situation? What are the issues around immigration policy that might affect you here locally in Cleveland, and how does that relate to the national debate? And I think you can educate yourselves, you can educate your classmates by starting with those kinds of immediate issues, maybe.
I'll follow up with that. I have so many possible narratives about how I got into this that I'm not going to go into them. Instead, I want to mention an article by one of my mentors, Laura Nader, that is one of her most famous articles called Up the Anthropologist, in which she's advocating that anthropologists study up. And this was in 1970, before a lot of us had really started studying the structures of power. There was a real tradition of studying the impoverished published, which leads to interpretations like the culture of poverty interpretation, which tends to see only the poor and not see the people who are oppressing the poor, and see them as responsible for replicating their own culture. In that article, she spoke about student projects that were particularly exciting, and quoted a lot of her undergraduate students. And she talked about indignation as motive. And this, for me, is really important. The idea that students should study what pisses them off. They should figure out what really makes them angry, and that's what they should study, not just some topic because it sounds academic or intellectual. And they should study what infuriates them, not just in terms of who and how people suffer. And this speaks to what Elizabeth was saying in terms of the memory just of violence or suffering, but rather they should study how those people resist, and even more importantly, who's responsible for it, and what are the structures of violence that make people suffer, or that victimize people, not in agentless ways, but understand these structures of power, because if you start out with something that is really a passion for you, then you're really going to learn a lot more from that. And I would second what Elizabeth said about reaching out to the community and working with the local community, but also making, I think, studying things. What I said in terms of Laura Nader's suggestion is also really important. But also, there's some great organizations. I mean, what an amazing solidarity community you guys have in Cleveland. I'm jealous. In Washington, we have so many people that believe so strongly in the power of lobbying that they're not that engaged. We have a number of wonderful people as well, but you don't sense the kind of real strong community that I'm sensing here. So you've got groups that are here today, like the Interreligious Task Force on Central America or SOA Watch, that are always welcoming young people into their fold. And, it's a really great way to get involved with people who are already doing that kind of mobilization, rather than also reinventing the wheel, which can have its own merits. But I think it's really good to get involved with some of these groups that are doing fantastic work as a vehicle for a better understanding and creating more of a movement here at home.
I just would like to commend you for having an interest in this subject in high school, having had 3 kids go through high school and never learning a thing about Latin America with me being in the home. I think it's great.
And my question is, when creating text, and I'm using the word text very generally, documentary films, academic publications, translation of books, what ethical questions are you asking yourself so that you truly capture the very powerful message, that you are hearing and that you have, recorded or preserved?
That will be, well, we can have your very short question and short answers, so we can have both questions, and then we'll be it.
I guess first and foremost, I have a sort of Hippocratic oath for myself, and that's first, do no harm. And beyond that, to practice an ethics of listening, I think, and that's highly contextualized, and to try and be as collaborative as possible, knowing that that's an imperfect process.
Yeah, I would certainly share those fundamental ethical points. I tried to bring up a little bit in my talk about the difficulties of dealing with testimony and contextualizing it in a way which doesn't kind of impose one's own categories on it, and I try to be aware of that.
Just following up on these same ideas, I think an important part of solidarity work as intellectuals is not falling into the rhetorical trap of speaking for people or giving people voice, but rather privileging the voices of other people. For the first 6 months after the Honduran coup, I really wrote very little on my own, and all I did was translate firsthand accounts that were coming out that were fantastic and better than anything I could have written, that were coming out in Spanish. And I think, really, it's important to not let your ego get ahead of you when you're doing solidarity work, and that includes the writing and the representations that we do.
I guess I think too theologically in this manner. Words that came to me were hermeneutics of humility, which was echoed by them, of charity, of allowing different voices to exist, to stand there, even if they're in opposition, to let them be there in their own integrity, but really an echoing of what everyone else has said.
I graduated from Beaumont School, and in 2006 I was a senior, and I went to El Salvador, and we had mentioned earlier that you're ruined, and I truly was. I came home and I said to my mom, I'm going to save the world. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back. And what my mom said to me, and you guys have all mentioned that you need to act locally. My mom said to me, Sarah, you need to save Cleveland first. Save home first, and then you can go back. And I'm 22 now, and I'm gonna try and go back. But I've been, doing little things like this, and it's really, you have to, start here, and you can keep going and going and going. So that was my home. Thank you.
And now we're having some closing remarks by Rhonda Williams.
I say give the panel a round of applause. How about that? I say give yourselves a round of applause for being the diehard, staying with us, coming out, and all of those who actually were here yesterday and this morning who had to transition to other things, and I thank them as well for being here. I want to close by really just giving thanks, and probably not surprisingly, a couple quotes, given that's been my MO since I started last night. I want to thank again the sponsors for this event. And that's the Interreligious Task Force on Central America and CWRU Centers, the Floorstone Mathers Center for Women, the Halanan Project for Peace and Social Justice, the Inamori Center, the Interreligious Council, and Share the Vision, whose sponsorship this wouldn't have been possible without with the Social Justice Institute and Alliance here at Case Western Reserve University. Let me close with two quotes. One actually is from a T-shirt from someone in this room. I was sitting behind her. I don't know if she's still here, but I was sitting behind her, and I just happened to look up and read her T-shirt, and I said, oh, wow. And her T-shirt said this. It said, "The difficult we'll do right now. The impossible will take a little while," by Billie Holiday. And I want to follow that up with saying this from Don Freeman, who's a local activist who I quoted earlier. He said, through relentless and consistent struggle, around or regarding a priority, forward movement, progress can be made. And that's where I want us to end. For all of us to think about the ways in which we can engage in that process through our intellectual work, through our activist work, our community work, through our interpersonal work, in whatever ways possible that we see through relentless and consistent struggle around or regarding a priority, forward movement and progress can be made. Thank you so much for coming out. This has been a wonderful 2 days.